Thank you very much for that introduction, Ashok. Uh, I don't know if you remember, but I think it's now, I came to your office first in 2001, so it's now 20 years complete. All right, let me share my screen and thank you all for attending this webinar. I hope to convey some of the excitement that I have about this area. Raj, can you just confirm that you're able to see it? Because I don't like going full screen because I can't see the rest of my slides, but this
Yeah, I
should.
can see your screen.
Yes,
Okay.
we can see your screen.
Okay.
We'll interrupt you in case there is a problem.
Sure. So I have a subtitle to the talk, which is the talk is titled Quantum Technology and Applications, and the subtitle is Opportunity for Academia Industry Partnerships. And the reason I use the subtitle is because that is the goal for me these days, is to encourage more partnership between academia and industry and to be able to take quantum technology forward in India. I gave this talk or a flavor of this talk recently to the IIT alumni, where I was talking about three questions, right, that I was trying to answer. What is the quantum technology buzz about? How do you translate quantum science into technology? And when will you first see quantum technology working at scale? Right? And hopefully before the end of this talk, you will have answers to all of these in some form. When we talk of quantum technologies, we are talking of different things. There's quantum computing, there's quantum communications, there's sensing and metrology, and there's quantum materials. These actually form the four verticals under the quantum science, engineering science and technology initiative from the DST that started a couple of years ago. And they will also form the verticals under the national mission on quantum technology and applications. We are hopeful that NMQTA will kickstart sometime this year. It was announced in the budget last year. And we hear that maybe in the next couple of months, we will get more details on that. If you look at quantum computing itself, it is actually a race. There are a large number of companies involved. There's IBM, Google, D-Wave, all working on superconducting qubits. These are different technologies. There's Honeywell and IonQ working on ion traps. Intel works on its strengths, which are spin qubits. Microsoft has bet on topological insulators. And there are a couple of startups working on using photonics. I need to tell you this because quantum computing today is still in the very early days. It's like having the battle between VHS and Betamax. You do not know which one is going to win, and it's not necessarily true that the better technology will win. It is going to be driven by market forces and who's able to play that game better. At the bottom right out here, I have another line out here that I'm making a distinction. It's on circuits versus annealers. These are two different types of ways of doing the same quantum computing. D-Wave does annealers, and IBM, Google, Rigetti, Alibaba are doing circuits. And I'll try to explain some of that as we go along. Before we go too far ahead, I wanted to show you some pictures. These are some pictures of Google 72 qubits, IBM's 50 qubits, Rigetti 16 qubits. The chip itself is a small device. This is Google's chip called Bristlecone, and it sits inside this shiny little thing, which is a dilution refrigerator. So the dilution refrigerator takes this temperature of this chip down to 20 millikelvin. This is as close to zero as we can get today. And the reason we do that is because we do not want environmental noise affecting the properties of what is on this chip. We use superconducting Josephson junctions out there, and they will be superconducting maybe at a few Kelvin, but by lowering the temperature, we reduce the impact of the environment. Now out here, I have D-Wave, which says it's got 5,000 qubits, and Honeywell that says it has 150 qubits. So one must ask why IBM and Google get so much attention if there are other people who have orders of magnitude more qubits. And the answer is because the technology is a little different. Although the superconducting Josephson junctions are still the same for D-Wave, it does things very differently from what IBM and Google do. Honeywell is building ion traps, and they announced their announcement of 150 qubits was after many years of operating in stealth. That too is a very promising technology. But again, with all these technologies, they have their own challenges. So the idea is this: we are building unique hardware to solve hard problems. The circuit-based systems, which was Google and IBM, are traditional gate-based systems. I mean, they're thinking like people who build VLSI circuits. You know, you have gates, you have OR gates, NAND gates, and you're trying to put these together in some form to do operations. The annealers on the other side are doing what is called wave-based computing. They're just trying to minimize energy. And my easiest analogy of that is if you take a empty box with a bunch of pebbles and you want to arrange them such that the smaller pebbles are at the bottom and the larger pebbles are on the top. In the circuit-based system, you will pick the smaller pebbles and put them one by one at the bottom before you put the larger ones. In the annealer, you'll just dump them all in the box and shake the box very hard. And as you keep shaking the box, the smaller pebbles go to the bottom and the larger pebbles are at the top. So in some sense, the annealers are not trying to do traditional gate-based computing. And I think that understanding helps us understand some of the reasons why people get excited if IBM says they have 50 qubits, although D-Wave will have 5,000 qubits. The circuit-based systems use two properties of quantum mechanics, entanglement and superposition. The annealers are mostly working with superposition. There's not too much of entanglement happening out there. I will talk a little bit more about the technology, but before I do that, let me excite your imagination first with this slide. It's adapted from Gartner 2018, where they predicted that you'll see supremacy sometime in 2020, which we did. And then they said, okay, you're going to have this window of opportunity where you're going to solve optimization problems, combinatorial logistics, and quantum machine learning by about 2025. And these will also rely a lot on hybrid algorithms. And then after that, you will start getting the larger use cases on drug design, data mining, and logistics. And then, of course, by 2035, you will have this global arms race where everyone is trying to break encryption. So this breaking of encryption is what actually has been driving quantum computing for a while and quantum communications. But there are a lot of earlier applications that we can use. Now, private equity has also bought into this. You'll see that this is a chart from 2020, and it is already showing you the number of quantum computing startups is increasing. And you'll also see the volume of private equity to VC investment has been going up. Now, what are we trying to do? We are trying to translate basic science into research or translation research and then to industrial applications. And to do that, we solve certain NP-hard problems. Very common examples of NP-hard problems are bin packing. Airbus has a challenge to say that can you do a 3D bin packing problem where you can pack an assortment of crates into my Airbus. There's route optimization, smart vehicles or delivery, Swiggy, Zomato, they all require to do some kind of route optimization for their vehicles. You can think of doing that even for networks, switch networks. And then there's classification. I have students who do binary classification on images. That is also a very promising area. And then the ones that make money, portfolio optimization. So you have hedge funds who are very interested in how do you solve this problem of minimizing your risk while you're optimizing your portfolios. The lower hanging fruits are also in chemistry and biology and physics, where you're actually solving hard problems of simulating systems. So if you want to design a new battery, you want to know how the chemistry of the battery is going to change if you make certain changes, and those are done using quantum simulations. So things like that are also best run on quantum computers. But do you always use a quantum computer? And the answer is no. I mean, the quantum computer is not going to solve every problem. It is going to solve certain problems of certain size better than a classical computer. On this graph, for example, on the x-axis, I have the size of the problem. On the y-axis is the time taken to find a solution in some arbitrary units. And what it says is that if you run the search algorithm, which is called Grover search algorithm, it will beat the classical search algorithm after a certain size of the problem. So you have to find a database of the right size and you want to search it, which is why Google was interested in quantum computing. So you understand out here when you see a graph like this that you can't start saying that the quantum computer is faster than the classical computer without picking up the right algorithm and the right problem size. So that is in some sense, that is where the research is today, where we are making advances in identifying algorithms and problems that can be used. So if you go back to our quantum future, this is actually April 21 from McKinsey, and they say that the adoption rate is about 2.9 out of 5, which means we are somewhere transitioning from beginners to learners. Several pre-competitive activities have moved to a competitive stage, and companies have begun to hire quantum scientists. And you're talking of companies in automotives, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, aerospace and defense, and financial services. So very soon we are expecting that we will, maybe in the next 3 to 4 years, we will have businesses seeing impact. So how do you translate quantum science into technology? That was the second question. And I'll start you off with a quote by a famous scientist, David Deutsch, who said that computers are physical objects and computations are physical processes. What computers can or cannot do is determined by the laws of physics and not by pure mathematics. And I think that is very deep because a lot of people get caught up into learning quantum mechanics. If I say, tell a student, let's do quantum computing, they say, let me start learning quantum mechanics. You don't necessarily need to learn quantum mechanics in order to do quantum computing. I came up with a second one when I was struggling with building certain equipment. And I told the staff, I said, you have to believe in physics and then rely on engineering. You cannot only believe in physics. Physics tells us that something will happen, but if you run a bad experiment, it just won't happen. So you have to rely on precision engineering in order to be able to see the quantum effects. What are these effects that we are talking about? Let me introduce a very little bit of math for you. In quantum computing, we use qubits. We do not use bits. So on the left out here is what is called the Bloch sphere. It was also called the Poincare sphere by the photonics community. So today we call it the Bloch Poincare sphere. And if you imagine that your classical bits are on the north pole and the south pole of the sphere, a qubit is anywhere on the sphere. So the sphere has radius unity, and a qubit will sit anywhere on the sphere, and it is denoted by a symbol psi. It is also denoted by this particular vertical line as greater than arrow. So that is a ket, and its opposite is a bra, so that together they become a bracket. Right? So you split the bracket into two halves, a bra and a ket, and you describe any state on the sphere in terms of its two angles, theta and phi. So if you are familiar with 3D geometry, it's a very simple problem. But you realize that once you're on the sphere, you have an infinite number of possibilities. So you're no longer limited to being on 0 and 1. You can have 0, 1, you can have plus x, minus x, you can have plus y, minus y. And these span the entire sphere. So any point on the sphere can now be described in terms of these orthogonal states. How does this help us? Well, what it means is that when I have a point on a sphere, I have a probability of measuring it. Now, my measurements are always along the north pole, south pole axis. So if the state is sitting somewhere at some other angle, I will end up making a measurement that is proportional to the amplitude along the plus z direction, and or the amplitude along the minus z direction. And that sort of gives me the probability of finding this state. So the key difference in quantum computing is that versus classical computing is that if you say 2 plus 2, a classical computer will say it's 4, a quantum computer will say it may be 4. Right? And you have to run it many times. You have to run it 1,000 times and collect your statistics, and then you'll get the answer that is 4. The advantage, of course, is that you can run it very fast many times. So here is what we call the magic of superposition. So if you start off with a state that is in a superposition of the North Pole and the South Pole. So in this particular case, it's on the equatorial plane. It's the plus x state. And you run it through a gate or an operation. We call this a unitary operation, but that's not terribly relevant right now. If you run it through some operation, what comes out is the answer on both the 0 state and the 1 state simultaneously. So you run it through only one operation and you manage to get the answer on both states. So if I make a measurement along the 0 state, I will get f of 0. So I evaluated this function for the input 0. And if I make a measurement on at the state 1, then I will get the output f of 1. And in that sense, I've evaluated this function with the qubit 1. So this is the power of superposition, that I can run, instead of 2, I can run any number out here, and I will evaluate them all simultaneously. This means that I have only one operation to do, and I suddenly have a lot of computing power. How do you understand this computing power? You understand it for a single qubit on the sphere itself. So in this particular example, I'm doing a rotation about the x-axis, taking the state from 0 to 1. Then I'm applying what is called a Hadamard gate H, taking it from the 1 state to the minus x state, and then applying another rotation about the z-axis that takes it to the plus state. And once I'm sitting out here and I make a measurement, I will get plus half or minus half because it's on the equatorial plane. So that is an example of how quantum computing can be imagined. Right? Unlike classical computing, you're not doing something like this on a sphere. In quantum computing, you're identifying locations on the sphere and you're applying gates to do this. This is a very tedious way of explaining things. So we have our own circuit diagrams. Our circuit diagrams are usually in terms of the input state, the 0 states, and then you have 2 qubit gates. So once you start getting into quantum computing, you get familiar with something like this. Now, of course, since I can no longer use spheres, I have to develop my own mathematics. And so we develop linear algebra. And this is something that as engineers we have done. It's fairly simple. You represent the 0 state by a vector 1, 0 and the 1 state by a vector 0, 1. And every gate is a matrix. So it becomes a 1, 0, 0, 0. And when you apply a matrix, so for example, when you apply the H matrix on this vector 1, 0, you will get the 1, 1 state because it's a rotation and on the sphere. So without going into too much detail about this, I'm going to leave the idea with you that if you want to do quantum computation, you need to have a good understanding of linear algebra. And of course, remember, I told you that it's not just 0 and 1. You want to have any number of states. So you're actually going to have longer and longer matrices, and this is an example of it. So you have what is known as a controlled NOT. Like in classical computing, you have the NOT gate. In quantum computing, you have the controlled NOT gate. What it means is that it's a NOT only if the second bit is a 1, right? And that you will see by this matrix out here, the lower right diagonal of the matrix has been flipped around. So that is no longer diagonal. So when the second bit becomes 1, then the bit flips. Similarly, you can go to 3 qubit gates, or this is a Toffoli gate, and you'll see that it becomes 8 by 8 matrix. And you can now imagine, you can see how this thing is going to scale. It's going to just become larger and larger as you add qubits. So the important thing is that for every qubit you add, you'll get 2 more elements in your matrix. But as I mentioned, it's not about matrices. You actually have to implement these things. So here's a slide that tries to capture all the different technologies. It's what I call the quantum zoo. You have individual atoms and photons. These are either in traps, cavity traps or ion traps, and then there's linear optics. Then there's the superconductors, and I'll spend a little time explaining how these superconductors work. Then there are the semiconductors, and then there are even more exotic ideas of like single phosphorus atoms in silicon. Now, to the left is what is important. What is on the top works. We know it works. We have been working with them. What is on the bottom scales, and this is where the research is. We are somewhere in the middle out here when we talk about superconducting qubits, and they are starting to scale, and they are definitely working. So what do all these things try to do? And I will explain that starting with some little basic physics. See, when we started learning quantum mechanics, we were taught about energy levels. So here, for example, on the left is the electron potential energy landscape of the radial distance from the nucleus. And there is a potential well out here. However, the potential well is not continuous, does not support continuous energy states. It supports discrete energy states. And those lowest two discrete energy states are called 0 and 1. These form your qubits. So an electron that is in an orbit is not necessarily in 0 and 1, it is in some superposition state. And if you can control that, you can do quantum computing. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to do this. You cannot control individual atoms. So what we try to do instead is to build artificial atoms. And it turns out that the simplest artificial atoms are actually capacitors and inductors. A resonant circuit like this also has discrete frequency values at which it resonates. And those discrete frequency values can be interpreted as qubits. So the artificial atoms are actually simple LC circuits. Well, I say they're simple, but they do get more complicated. What we use is not just a regular inductor. What we use is a nonlinear inductor. This is that superconducting junction, and this is the circuit element. What it does is that it takes the potential well and makes it into something like a parabola, but it still retains the 0 and the 1 energy states. Now, of course, I'm showing you many more of them, but we will focus on the 0 and the 1 because that is what we use for most of our computation. These circuits, the capacitor and the inductor, is shown as a micrograph out here, and I'll give you some details on how this works in the next couple of slides. So what do the wave functions themselves look like? If this is your parabola, then your wave is resonant when it's sitting in either the 0 state or the 1 state. And every time you want to do an operation, what you're doing is you're transferring energy from this state to this state and or vice versa. And if you don't do a complete transfer, then you're in some superposition state. Okay, I promised you to explain what these qubits look like, and this is what they look like. They're fairly simple structures. There is a substrate, which is dielectric. There are two metal pads, which act as capacitors. And then there is an inductor in the middle, which is nonlinear. This is your Josephson junction. When you have something like this, what you also have are charges, and the charges will move across the superconductor, and that creates your transfer of charge, and you will have capacitance effects out there. When you have charge moving across like that, you also have electromagnetic fields, and these electromagnetic fields follow, if you remember your physics, they'll follow your right-hand thumb rule, and they will wrap around the little piece of superconductor out there. So using the superconductor means that we're able to resonate this LC circuit without any ohmic losses. So the idea is quite simple. We want to build LC circuits, and we want to build them lossless. The closest example we have in classical mechanics is actually mass at the end of a spring. That also resonates. So if you think back, what we have really done is gone through 100 years of physics. We knew classical mechanics with a mass at the end of a spring, which was called the harmonic oscillator. We then went to electrical circuits that were resonating. And then we started building those circuits with superconducting junctions. And these are now called transmons. They have a nonlinear inductor. So once you have these building blocks, you can now start building circuits. So you combine many of them. You combine the linear circuit with the nonlinear circuit. You combine them with a microwave oscillator line. And you'll see the microwave oscillator up here. It is connected to this transmon out here with a superconducting qubit in the middle. And this whole thing now goes down to 2 millikelvin. So what does IBM do? IBM, in some sense, is now connecting them all up together. This is an example of their latest 53-qubit device. It's called Rochester. Here is an example of their 15-qubit device called Melbourne. And all of this sits inside this nice, neat little, shiny little toy called a dilution refrigerator. Now, what is important to see out here is that not every bit is connected to every bit. So if you look at the Melbourne lattice itself, you will see that you're connecting them pairwise. And then at certain nodes, you might connect them to 3 others. So 8, for example, is connected to 6, 9, and 7. This is very important because it's not easy for me to take any qubit to talk to any other qubit. 0 to 8 doesn't, and 8 will not talk together. So although in principle, I've been saying that they will scale as 2 to the power m, that scaling happens only if they're all connected together. And in this case, they're not all connected together. So you have to do many what are called interchanges or swaps to get them to get 0 talking to 8. And these are still at 2 millikelvin interacting with the environment, and they become noisy. So there is a lot of challenge out there on how do you run something on computers that are connected like this. And that is where researchers come in and they say, okay, if you design algorithms that will use this connectivity, then you will be able to get the answers you want. So in some sense, today we are looking at application-specific quantum computers. They're not general purpose yet. The building blocks of a quantum computer, this is an example of the one from Honeywell. These will have, for example, out here, ion traps, and then they will have some optical multiplexers and photodetectors. There'll be a classical CPU and some qubit controls. So it's a mix of classical and quantum elements. It's a lot of engineering. We at IIT Madras are also working on another platform, which is Diamond. Now, it turns out that Diamond can also be made to work as qubits. And this is an example from Stuttgart, where they have got an array of nitrogen vacancies in Diamond. And these nitrogen vacancies will fluoresce with a red spot when they are excited as qubits. So if we can get an array of these, then we are suddenly having the ability to do quantum computing. What is the advantage of using Diamond? It works at room temperature. So if you're ever scared of setting up a 2 millikelvin temperature system in Chennai when it is 45 degrees, you can always think of room temperature materials that use Diamond. And this is an example where Diamond has its energy levels. Basically, you shine a green laser and it will fluoresce at red. And these become your energy states. And if you apply a magnetic field, you'll also get a splitting out here, and they become your qubits. So these kinds of experiments are happening. And there is a side benefit. I do not know if there are people out here from who are interested in diamonds, but the color of the diamond is very important. So if you have a pink diamond, for example, well, where does it get its pinkness from? It gets it from these energy levels. So what is normally what we call a defect actually increases the price of the diamond in the market. We are now entering the realm of photonics because we started talking about lasers. So I thought I'll tell you that, give you a little bit of idea that these ideas of qubits are also available in photonics. It's very simple. The polarization of light can be either vertically upwards or horizontally. And if it is vertical, it is 0. If it is horizontal, it is 1. And if it is at some angle in the middle, it is in a superposition of the vertical and horizontal. So anyone who's worked with light or waves will understand some of these ideas very quickly. We actually have non-classical light that we tend to use. So non-classical light is where photons do not come together in bunches. They actually start spreading out in what is called anti-bunching, and they come one after the other. Once you have these single photons, you can start running interesting experiments. And the most interesting experiment that you run with a photon is a time-tested experiment, which is the diffraction of light. So in the traditional two-slit experiment, you had Young's interference fringes. You had bright and dark fringes. When you sent plain light going through two slits, they would create these spherical patterns. And then they would have these interference fringes. You can do the same thing with electrons, which is what they showed. And then you can also do it with photons, because photons are also waves. So this wave particle duality comes to our assistance when you want to do computing or quantum optics with photons. So here is the computational space. We understand that waves interfere. So those LC circuits you were seeing earlier also behave like this. Photons also behave like this. But if you start looking at the computational space of these waves interfering, you'll see that with 64 qubits, you end up with 10 to the power 19 computational paths, assuming they're all talking to each other, remember. But it turns out that it's very hard to get them to all talk to each other. It's like throwing stones in a pond. The ripples all will talk to each other, but not with the same efficiency. So you have to understand that a little bit. There have been attempts to do optical quantum computing. And this is one of the areas that we are working on at IIT Madras also, because you can do a fair amount of work with photons themselves. So what is it that we try to do? We try to solve hard problems, right? So this is a nice article, a review article that I would recommend to people. It's called the Ising Formulation for Many NP Problems. And there are 21 NP complete problems that are described in this paper that can be set up as an Ising problem. But what is an Ising problem? The Ising problem is actually something that is taken from statistical physics. It is how we understood ferromagnetism and anti-ferromagnetism. When you take magnets, they tend to line up either parallel to each other or anti-parallel to each other, depending on the coupling coefficient. And this value of coupling coefficient, if it is greater than 0, it's ferromagnetic. If it's less than 0, it's anti-ferromagnetic. Turns out that this very idea was what this paper talked about. And since 2014, everyone who knows how to solve these problems, which we have known for almost 60 or 70 years, is now saying, okay, we can solve these problems. And that means the NP-hard problems are now being cast as what are called quadratic unconstrained binary optimization problems, or QBOS. And this is straight out of operations research. So whether you're talking of portfolio management or bin packing or routing problems, we're all solving QBOS. So the question is, can you build an Ising machine? And it's interesting that during the lockdown, some of our students came into our labs and built an Ising machine. This is a 2D Ising machine that was built for about $10,000. It's some optics and some electronics. The electronics was actually fairly simple. It was a red Pitaya board with a zinc FPGA. And hopefully this video will play, and you can alert me if it doesn't play. All right. So let me explain to you what you're seeing. What you're seeing is a 2D lattice, and it's random. And the idea is that I need it to reach its minimum energy state, and it should become a checkerboard. And it's now on iteration 5 at the top. And as it runs, you will see a checkerboard pattern starting to emerge. By iteration 25, 26, it has already emerged. It has still got a few defects. And by the time it reaches about iteration 50, it has mostly reached its minimum energy state. It turns out that it's probabilistic. It doesn't get its fully minimum energy, and these defects continue to remain. But you will see that annealers, this is an example of an annealer, gets to its minimum energy state quite fast. So, I mean, these are students who have run this and built this and run this. So you can imagine what is happening if when companies are throwing hundreds of millions of dollars on this problem. So the national mission is actually, as I mentioned, has many verticals. It also has many technologies. And it's a large collaboration. And we are hoping that IIT Madras will lead some of that collaboration. So the question is, when will you see the first quantum tech working at scale? Well, I like to answer that question with this chart. It says that you need about 1,000 to 10,000 qubits before you start seeing something that is working to scale. We are today reaching at about 100 qubits. And if you get to 1,000 and 10,000, then we will see it working to scale. And that is because there is a lot of error, and you need more qubits to do error correction. But the important question is, if the goal was to break your passwords, break your RSA encryption, when will you know that it is being done? They won't tell you, right? I mean, if I break your password, I'm not going to tell you because I can't steal any information. So the idea is that if you have a quantum computer, a 128-bit password is broken. Public key and cryptography is broken with a quantum computer. Right? And this is something that scares people. What is the current state of the art? The current state of the art to the left out here is IBM's roadmap. It says, and you may not be able to read it, so I'll read it for you. It says by 2021, I'll have 127 qubits. That is this year. By 2023, I'll have 1,000 qubits. This is becoming very real now in 2 years. E-Wave released its 5,000 qubit machine, right? So people are already scaling these things up, and there's a very real chance that things will go south in terms of encryption. Why is that? There is a second algorithm called Shor's factoring algorithm, and that speeds up the factoring of large numbers into its primes uh, by orders, right? And so what that means is that if you were able to use a 128-bit key today with a quantum computer, someone will be able to break it. What does that mean for us? So this is an example of public key encryption. If you have two parties, Alice and Bob, they use this public key to encrypt data and decrypt data, and the eavesdropper cannot really see it. So all of today's public key encryption is transferring what is called a ciphertext, assuming that the keys are safe. But how do you ensure the key is safe? Well, quantum mechanics comes to your rescue again. What you do is you create a quantum channel. So we are now moved from quantum computing into quantum communication. The motivation was quantum computing, but suddenly it's become quantum communication because we are all scared about our digital data. So here what we do is we set up a quantum channel and we send information on single photons. So you remember I told you that the photon can also carry a qubit. It could be the polarization, could be horizontal or vertical. And so I sent those photons, and because it's a single photon, it cannot be destroyed, it cannot be copied. And eavesdropper, if they take it, I just don't care. And so I set up a key, and this key is then used to on encryptors to transfer data on communication channels. This is what China has done, right? In January of this year, they demonstrated that they could send these keys from Shanghai to Hefei to Jinan to Beijing across a lot of secure nodes. And at each of these 4 cities, they also had little networks that were connecting buildings up. Now, this is the world's first demonstration of large-scale quantum communications. And while the race for quantum computing is on, people are already securing their data networks. It's not sufficient to just build the physical layer. You also have to worry about how these things get used and interconnected. And there are ITU standards that are being formed. And it is important for India to participate in some of these bodies to be able to contribute its own standards to them. These networks and the cities are also being built in other places. So this, for example, is in Cambridge in the UK, where they've connected 3 such buildings separated by a few kilometers. 10 kilometers is the average length between 2 of them. And they demonstrate that they can transfer information securely between them. So one of the things that I did was I said, we have to do this in India. And we coined the acronym MACAN, Metro Area Quantum Access Networks. And we've been funded by the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology to build one of these networks between IIT Madras Research Park, Society for Electronic Transaction Security, and the NIC buildings at Besant Nagar. You'll see that on the Google map, it's not a very long distance. If you walk it, it'll take about an hour, but it's otherwise about 10 minutes by road. This sort of becomes your test bed for quantum communications. And I encourage people who are in the research park to say, hey, wait a minute. India is building its first quantum network, and it's actually going to get set up in the research park. So shouldn't you get involved? Once you have something like this, you can also imagine that you can link it up to the National Knowledge Network. The NIC buildings in Besant Nagar are the source of the National Knowledge Network in Chennai. And the idea is, can you do long distance security also? And we have done that. I mean, at Quantum Key Distribution, IIT Madras has been running for about 10 years. We have done about 100-kilometer demonstrations. We have our own IPs on a lot of these things. We have also gone ahead and done 150-kilometer demonstrations using other protocols. So in some sense, we are really going ahead and saying, let us secure our information while we are also working on quantum computing. So to do all of this, what we have done is we have facilitated, or we proposed to IIT Madras that we will set up a Center for Quantum Information Communication and Computing, or the acronym is very neat. It's called QUIC, right? So CQUIC. And the 3 verticals out here are networks, information and computing and sensing. And we also run a lot of collaborative work with other people doing things like quantum machine learning, blind quantum computing, tomography, cluster states. So these are all buzzwords that are there. There is one nice one out here. It's called secret sharing. It's very interesting. If I have this link between IIT Madras and NIC and SETS, I can set up a secret sharing protocol that says that unless both the parties, SETS and NIC, agree, the information that I send from IIT Madras will be secure. No, neither of them can individually see that information, but both of them together can come together and get the information that IIT Madras sends them. So you can imagine that there are opportunities to set up new protocols like this that will improve our networks. The platforms themselves that we are talking about, I mentioned that we are doing diamond photonics. We have got silicon photonics running. We've got linear and nonlinear optics running. And then we are also now looking at qubits on the cloud, which have already reached technology readiness levels of 5 and greater. The quantum communications parts are actually fairly mature, but photonic quantum computing is not yet mature. None of this is actually possible without a large team. And these are some images of faculty members. There are about 15, 20 of them who are now getting involved. I've already missed a couple of them, I can see. Your students at the bottom, a few students. The people who are contributing to our efforts at IIT Madras are growing. You will see out here, they're coming from engineering, they're coming from management studies, they're coming from the sciences. We do need to get more engineers involved. So I'm hoping that people in the research park will be excited by this. So what is our vision? Our vision is to actually have leadership in quantum technology and application, right? So we have multi-party quantum networks with key management. We have quantum simulations. We have photonics-based quantum computing. We have machine learning as a service. We have a huge human resource development effort, and we do a large number of international conferences, workshops, and training programs. So all of this will contribute to the strategic plan for IIT Madras, right? So as a hub, we want to co-brand the center. We want to develop manpower. We want to bring in domain knowledge, right? So there are companies that are interested in finance. There are companies that are interested in basic chemistry. There are companies that are interested in transportation. We are happy to engage with them. We will also use the quantum cloud and provide assistance to those companies. So I'd like to end my webinars usually with this one slide, which says, unite to build a quantum internet. This is not the job for one faculty member in IIT Madras or even 10 faculty members in IIT Madras. This is a job for about 100,000 people to come together to do something that is larger than each of us. And so this particular slide, which says, which was taken from a Nature article in 2016, sort of captures the essence of what I wanted to say today. Thank you very much. I think I have time for questions.